It's good to be here with you guys again. Thank you for coming out tonight to hear me talk about Botanical Latin, a subject that is often a little on the dry side. I try and make sure there's plenty of pictures in here and not too much text. You'll have to forgive me a couple of very text-rich slides because we're really trying to crack this difficult to learn language. But I'm keeping it very focused on the plants, and I hope at the end of it, you'll feel a little bit more confident in how to manage pronouncing, remembering, and saying these different Latin names. So let's get going. So I'm often told that Botanical Latin is a difficult subject. People say, I don't remember Latin names. Why do the names keep changing? Why are botanical names so hard to pronounce? Why can't we just use the English names? And why are we using Latin when nobody speaks Latin now? Well, all of those are very good points. And sometimes when I stand up to talk about Botanical Latin, I kind of feel like I'm going to be the target of some aggression from people who find it so frustrating. And that's why I put the picture of the tomatoes there. I've given this lecture before on the stage where I was actually concerned whether some tomatoes might actually be thrown at me. And just because I am a pedantic scientist, technically they're Solanum lycopersicon, not Lycopersicum esculentum. So let's get that right from the start. We want to start with our correct Latin names. So why do we bother with Latin names? What's the purpose of them? Well, common names of plants are not standardized. And if you are interested at all in bird watching, then you'll probably know that here in the US and in North America generally, the English names of birds are standardized. There are organizations that work out a standard name for every single bird. So whether you're in Alaska or you're in Florida, it is a blue jay, or it's a northern cardinal, or it's a palm warbler. That means that you can easily communicate about these birds across all that vast distance. But plant common names aren't standardized. There's no standard list of what the common name is for each particular plant. And so that means that in different parts of the country, the same plant will have different names. For people who speak languages other than English, they'll, of course, have additional names. And there'll be a whole suite of different traditional names as well, names that maybe have passed into history, but that are still occasionally used for plants and will be found in old parts of the literature. But there should only ever be one Latin name. So it's a good way of having a standard language, a standard format that we can all use. If you're looking to correctly identify a plant, then you need the Latin name. If you go into a nursery and ask somebody for a plant using an English name, maybe they don't recognize that English name, or it's an English name that's applied to multiple different plants, and you can end up being given the wrong thing. And you can think of names like cedar, pine, lily, being applied to a wide range of different plants, often plants that are completely unrelated. So the Latin name ensures you get exactly what you're asking for. It's also really key if you're trying to find information about plants. Whether you're searching in books and encyclopedias or you're online, having the Latin name, it means you're likely to get the relevant information about the correct plant and not any plant that happens to share some or all of that name. Of course, if you communicate with people in different countries, then it's important to know Latin names too, because that's one universal language. In times past, I've had to go through taxonomic journals written in Mandarin, and the only part of it I can understand is the Latin name, but it shows how well it works as a language for international communication. Also, if you're ever interacting with any kind of government or official agency, they will also generally use the Latin name as the standard name for that plant, because it's the only standard name that we have. And so there are lots of instances where it's important to know what a plant's Latin name is. And I'm often asked, why Latin? Actually, a lot of the botanical names that we use are actually Greek. And many of our Latin names are actually derived from other languages too. But why Latin? Well, historically, Latin and also Greek were the languages of scholarship. They were languages that were used in teaching. If you went to university in Europe in the past, you would have been taught exclusively in Latin and Greek. So students were required to learn these two languages, and it was considered something of a rite of passage and also a way of expanding their minds and making their minds more nimble. If they could successfully learn how to speak and write in Latin and Greek, then their minds would be ready to learn a lot more things. It's also that a lot of historical texts are written in Greek and Latin, and medieval and scholars and later on had a great deal of respect for the works of the ancients. And so they would often go back to those Greek and Latin texts to find wisdom. And so for many, many years, scholarship, the language of scholarship was Latin. And so it was perfectly natural that botanists would start to name plants and animals using Latin because it was their language. It's also, of course, a dead language. There aren't any countries today, with the possible exception of the Vatican, that regularly speak Latin. And because the language is dead, it isn't really changing. All languages change over time. The English of today is very different from the English of 300 or 400 years ago, but Latin stays the same. That means that it's kind of more standardized. Botanical Latin is a written language, and that's an important thing to remember too, because a written language, when you're dealing with a written language, pronunciation really isn't important. And we'll come back to pronunciation in a little bit. But of course, Latin doesn't belong to any one country. And if we were to have a standard non-Latin language for plant names, well, which language would we pick? I mean, obviously, we would likely choose English, but there are plenty of people around the world who don't speak English and for whom that would not be a fair choice. So Latin is a kind of a compromised language. It doesn't belong to anybody, so nobody has special favor. It's also an international language for a lot of communication. So whether you're a scholar or an academic, you will have often come across Latin. If you were religious, of course, and particularly in the Catholic Church, but in other churches, Latin has been at the base of teaching. And it's not just us in botany. Across the life sciences, you'll hear Latin. You also hear it in mathematics, in physics. So in lots of different branches of scholarship, Latin was an important measure and still is. And if you look on the left-hand side of the page, what you'll see is the very first page of Species Plantarum, the work of Carl Linnaeus. And Linnaeus is, of course, widely known as the father of taxonomy. The two Latin word name, which we call the Latin binomial, and we'll come to that a little later, that was one of his creations. And Species Plantarum, which was released in 1753, is the beginning point for all botanical names. When we go back and look, any names that predate 1753 are not valid. We only use names that were published from 1753 onwards. And of course, you can see there it is, all written in Latin. Now, I don't like putting big chunks of text onto slides, but I just like this quote so much. This is from William Stern, who is a now late botanist and scholar of Latin. His work on Botanical Latin is one of the most well-known of the books on Botanical Latin, although it's a little technical for general gardening readers. But in it, he described Botanical Latin, and that's what I want to read you here. A language of special technical application derived from Renaissance Latin with much plundering of ancient Greek, which has evolved mainly since 1700 and primarily through the work of Carl Linnaeus to serve as an international medium for the scientific naming of plants in all their vast numbers and manifold diversity. These include many thousands of plants unknown to the Greeks and Romans of classical times, and for which names have had to be provided as a means of reference. What that says is basically everything I've already just said, that it was the language of scholars, and that it began with the Greeks and Romans, but later had to be developed to name plants that the Greeks and Romans had not met themselves. Pardon me. So do gardeners need Latin names? Can't we just get on with our English names? Well, this is one of the borders at Heronswood. This is in our perennial borders. And you can look at it and just see it as a beautiful backdrop. You can see it as a beautiful palette of herbaceous plants and shrubs working together. And that's absolutely fine. If you want to view it purely from its aesthetic appeal and not really know what individual plants are, that's absolutely fine. But if you want to know anything more about these plants, you really need to dive in further. Hydrangea aspera, Eryngium planum, Berberis thunbergii, Sidalcia, Veronica, Musa, Symphyotrichum. All of these names are labels for these individual plants. And if you want to know anything about those individual plants, the size they grow to, when they need to be pruned, what pests and diseases they deal with, how best to propagate them, when their flowering season is, then knowing this Latin name is crucial. It's the only true name for that plant. So you can absolutely garden and never remember a Latin name, but learning a Latin name is the key to unlocking a world of information about your plants. And it will make you a better gardener. Now, one of the most vexing subjects for gardeners as they begin to learn Botanical Latin is pronunciation. And I was told early on in my career, and I've always repeated it since, that there is no standard pronunciation for Botanical Latin. It is indeed a written language. It was created for publishing and writing about plants. So you're never wrong. And I found that quite reassuring. As a foreigner here in the United States, I often find that the way I pronounce a Latin name is different to how an American pronounces a Latin name. And that doesn't matter as long as you both know what you're talking about. Now, many will say that it is classical Latin pronunciation that should be used. Poppycock. And let's face it, how many of us today learn classical Latin pronunciation? Very few of us. When I was at high school, I'd love to have learned Latin, but the Latin teacher had retired in the 1970s. And so, like many people of my generation, Latin was not something that we had the opportunity to learn. There is no standard pronunciation for Botanical Latin. And different people from different countries will often pronounce Botanical Latin differently depending on the accents and commonalities from their own language. So English speakers will use a different pronunciation from Spanish speakers or from American speakers or from French speakers, and that's absolutely fine. Ecclesiastical Latin has a completely different pronunciation. So if you're used to hearing Latin in church, again, it will be pronounced in a slightly different way. So there's no standard way of pronouncing these words. Just get used to saying them and how you hear them. And what you'll find is once you get out into the gardening community and start talking about Botanical Latin, you'll start to hear the names that are familiar and that sound the same, and you'll probably modify your pronunciation to match what the kind of general pronunciation is. But one of the ones that always gets me, what I've always called dahlia, which I've noticed Americans pronounce as dahlia, causes a great deal of confusion with people even thinking that when I say dahlia, I'm referring to dahlias, when of course I'm not. So pronunciation, never let anybody tell you that you're pronouncing it wrong, and don't feel embarrassed or afraid to speak up and use your Botanical Latin, even if you're saying it in a way that isn't common amongst your peers. Now, after pronouncing it, the next most common thing I'm asked about is how do you go about remembering it? Well, unfortunately, it would seem that, at least in part, it's how my brain is wired. I have a really good memory for Botanical Latin names. I have a really bad name for human names. It's a real downfall for me as a garden director, always trying to remember what somebody's name is. I remember what their face is, but I don't remember their name. But here's a few things that might help. Firstly, keep your plant labels. Most plants these days will come with a label, usually one pushed into the soil or tied around the plant. Try and keep them all. And I know not everybody has space or room for keeping a lot of stuff, but the way I do it is I have a series of Ziploc bags in my home. Each bag has written on the front of it the name of one of the beds in my yard. And in that bag, I stick all the labels of the plants that go into that bed. At the end of each year, I go through all the bags, and if any of the plants have died, I then toss out their label. If the plant has been dug up and moved to another bed, I'll then take it out of one bag and stick it in the other. And that way I can easily refer back to the labels that I have if I don't remember what that plant name is. Another way of doing it is to record them on your phone. Most phones have a notes app that allows you to record data when you're out in the garden. It's a good way of having a portable memory that you can carry around of your plant names. And these days, of course, most phones have cameras on them too. So the other thing you can do is take photos of your labels. Photos of the labels, then you don't have to keep the actual plastic tag. Now, one of the things we're going to do tonight is we're going to learn some Latin names. And I find that learning the Latin name does make it easier to remember. When it's just some random label, it doesn't mean very much. But once you start to understand some of the meaning behind the word, somehow it just makes it easier to sink into the brain. And one thing that's really useful to do is to learn some common Latin words, prefixes, and suffixes. Latin often will have little parts at the beginning of the word, a prefix, or little bits at the end of a word, a suffix, that you'll find in lots of different plant names. So if you know what they mean, then you're already a step ahead when dealing with plant names. And we'll have a look at a few of those as we go through today too. But it's probably worth starting by talking about how plants get their names. What is the process? And it really begins with collection. So botanists spend a lot of time out in the field looking at plants, and if they find something that they don't know what it is, usually they will collect a specimen of it. And we would call that a herbarium specimen. That's because those specimens are kept in a herbarium, which is just a special building with temperature control and just the right conditions in order to keep dried plant specimens in good condition. You can see me here preparing a herbarium specimen. It is an impatiens, a busy lizzie, and you can see I'm carefully laying it out inside a piece of newspaper. I'll fold that piece of newspaper over the top, and then I'll put it into a plant press, and then I'll gently squeeze it. The whole thing will then go into an oven. The oven set at a very low temperature, but just enough to dry that specimen out. And once a plant specimen is completely dry, it can keep in that condition for hundreds of years. We still have plant specimens at the Kew Herbarium dating back to Darwin and earlier. So if you get the plant perfectly dry, it will keep for a very long time. Today, of course, we have DNA technology, and so botanists who find plants that they can't identify will also sometimes collect a little specimen of leaf. Usually they will store it in some silica gel to keep it really dry, and then from that they can extract DNA and find out more about the plant as well. Once they've collected their mystery plant, they then go and compare it with other plants that they already have in their collection. And these pictures here show two different herbarium specimens. You'll notice the plant has been stuck down onto a piece of card. And that's pretty important. The card offers rigidity because once a plant is dried, though it'll last a very long time, it does become brittle. Sticking it down onto this hard surface effectively acts like a skeleton, holding it in good form. It also means you can stack these sheets together so they don't take up so much room in the herbarium. And you can probably see little pieces of tape that stick the dried specimen down to the sheet. Also on there, you'll see some little color cards. Those are to help in future when looking at the specimens to work out colors of things, because obviously when a plant dries out, the color will change. But the most important thing on a herbarium specimen is the label. You'll see they have large labels down on the bottom right. Those labels include a lot of valuable information: where the plant was found, geographically, what kind of habitat, what plants were growing with it. What features of the plant can't you see in this specimen? Like, was it a tree? Was it a shrub? Was it a vine? How tall was it? Was it flowering? What color were the flowers? A whole realm of detail that you can't necessarily see on the dried specimen are all committed to the label. A scientist will gather together hundreds of specimens of these plants and compare them with the one that they collected in the wild. And that will help them to assess whether the thing that they found is a new species or a species that already exists. But should they decide that it is a new species, and these days they may also refer to some DNA studies too, they then go on to the publishing phase. And that is when you assign the plant its name. And this little description here is from a species that I named when I was doing my PhD. It's a palm species. And this is the way that the description is laid out. This is the formal way in which you describe a new species. You'll see that it starts with the name. Here the name is in italics, as all Latin names should be, Borassus acaeaceae. You'll then see my name and the names of my colleagues afterwards. So every botanical name has after it the names of the authors who first described it. Then below that, you'll see sb nov, which is abbreviated form of Latin that says species novum, new species. Below that, you'll see a brief description in Latin. That's a description of the plant. It's called, when I was a student only a few years ago, Latin descriptions were a necessary part of publication. Nowadays, they are not. That rule was changed fairly recently, but you can see a full Latin description there. And then below that, you'll see the word typus. And typus is a herbarium specimen that is the type. It is the original of that species. And if anybody around the world wants to know what that species looks like, they can go and look at that type specimen. And you'll see there the description of where that type specimen was discovered, the geographical area, and at the end, you'll see the word holotypus K. So holotype is the main type specimen, and K is the code for the Royal Botanic Gardens Q. So you can see from those codes that the plant that I collected has 3 type specimens, one at Q, one at the Fairchild Tropical Gardens in Miami, FTG, and one at the Botanical Garden of Ouagadougou in the country where the plant was collected. So this is the process by which plants receive their Latin name, from first a specimen of unknown identity all the way through to a published description. And when it comes time to giving the plant a name, there aren't really an awful lot of rules about what name you give the plant, only that you can't give it a name that has already been given to another plant. In this case, the plant was a member of the genus Borassus, and we named it after one of our colleagues, a man named Professor Ake Assi. So we named it after him. And naming plants after people is a long-established tradition in botanical history. So when plants have a Latin name, why do the names change? It's probably one of the most frustrating things for gardeners is that they get used to a botanical name, they're familiar with it, and then somebody comes along and tells them that it's changed. Well, there's a few different reasons why a plant's name might change, and the primary one is new scientific data. People, for gardeners at least, the Latin name is really just a label, but for scientists, the Latin name is a bit more than that. The Latin name indicates taxonomic relationships between species. So for example, if you have one species of aster and another species of aster, the fact that they both have the name aster indicates that they are genetically related to each other. And if new scientific data came out that suggested that they weren't so closely related as you thought, then they are likely to need a new name. So changes of names usually come about as the result of new scientific data. And one of the biggest causes of change in recent years has, of course, been DNA. Even when I was studying, DNA was a relatively new technology that had kind of begun in the 1960s, and it was still relatively expensive to work on DNA. Today, it's getting cheaper and it's getting faster, which means more DNA studies are being done, and we are discovering that some plant relationships that we thought we understood, maybe we didn't understand as well as we thought. And that then requires that the taxonomists come along and change the names. Now, there are other reasons why names might change. It may well be that there was an error in the original publication. And it may be that when the person named the plant, they created a duplicate name. So as an example, imagine somebody is walking around in Alaska and they find a spruce that they don't recognize. They want to give it a new name because they don't think it's been described before, and so they call it Picea alaskensis, the spruce from Alaska. At the same time, somebody's walking around on the coast of Siberia and they find a new spruce. They've not seen it before and they don't think it's been described before, so they call it Picea siberica, the spruce from Siberia. But then, years down the line, somebody sits down and looks at the two specimens, the one from Siberia and the one from Alaska, and realizes that actually they are the same species. They're only separated by that Bering Strait. Well, you can't have one species that has two names. So in such cases, what would happen is whichever name was published first will be the correct name for that species. And historically, at least, when communication between different countries wasn't as easy, this happened quite a lot. Today, of course, we have the internet. People are publishing their names online. And so it's easier for people in different countries to see what other people are working on. And therefore, less often mistakes like this will happen. But that was a common reason why botanical names will change. And the 4 pictures I have here are 4 plants that are probably fairly familiar to you in your gardens that have had a recent name change, often to the horror. So firstly, we have rosemary here, Rosmarinus officinalis. It's now a salvia. DNA evidence showed that rosemary was very closely related to sage. In fact, so closely related, it was nested right in the middle of the genus Salvia, and so it's now called Salvia rosmarinus. Gaura, the butterfly plant, for many years was Gaura lindheimeri. It's now Enothera lindheimeri, so it's now in the same genus as evening primrose. New England aster. Well, this is one of the worst changes because it went from a very easy to remember name to a very difficult to remember name. Aster novae Angli just means New England aster. It's now called Symphyotricum novae Angli. Not anywhere near as easy to spell or pronounce. And last but not least, one of our own native plants. This is an Oregon native shooting star, Dodecathion hendersonii, and it's been discovered that the Dodecathions are actually in the genus Primula. So they are now considered primroses, and this is Primula hendersonii today. So names are changing on a fairly regular basis. Actually, there's a lot less change than you might think. Sometimes it can feel like names are changing all the time. While they are, it rarely affects gardeners, but here are 4 instances where it definitely does. And this is my favorite because it shows the nature of tradition can go full circle. This is a fairly common bedding plant in the summer here, the Coleus. When it was originally published, it was given the name Coleus bloomii. Many, many years later, it was thought that this should be transferred to a different genus, and so it became Solenostemon scutellarioides. Then, later on, new scientific evidence came about, and it became Plectranthus scutellarioides. And recently, in the last 2 years, they've resurrected the genus Coleus, and this plant is now called Coleus scutellarioides. So it started in Coleus, and it ended in Coleus, and who knows where it will stop. Actually, it's not that common for plant names to change this much, but I like this example because it just shows how scientific evidence over several hundred years can lead to one plant ending up in 3 different genera. So a bit of very basic Botanical Latin, or at least the structure of Botanical Latin. The really important phrase that I used earlier in the lecture was one called the Linnaean binomial. Linnaean binomials are 2-word names, and an example here is Camellia japonica. Binomial just means 2 names. Linnaean, because this was the creation of Carl Linnaeus. And before 1753 and Linnaeus, every plant was given not just 2-word name, but a brief sentence in Latin as a description. He realized that that was very cumbersome, and he reduced it down just to 2 words. And that 2-word system is the one we still use today. But of course, scientists might make your life more difficult and complicate things a little further. The 2 words have their own names. So Camellia is the genus, and Japonica is the species. Japonica, of course, refers to the plant coming from Japan. Camellia is named after a botanist called Joseph Campbell. So Camellia japonica, genus and species. But camellias get a little bit more complicated. So we also have Camellia japonica subspecies hortensis. So a subspecies is a division of one species. And so Camellia japonica contains more than one subspecies. And one of those subspecies is called hortensis. Subspecies is kind of the highest level of division of a species. The next level is called variety. So we have Camellia japonica var concava. Var is short for variety. Varieties are only marginally different from each other, whereas subspecies are more different from each other. And forms are least different from each other. So here we have Camellia japonica forma albipetala. And in this case, the only thing that this is different from other camellias is that it has white petals, whereas Camellia japonica typically has red petals. So in this case, form means a very slight difference. Variety means a slightly bigger difference, and subspecies means an even greater difference. And generally, when you get to subspecies level, there may also be geographical variants. So you might find that one subspecies occurs on the mainland and the other subspecies occurs on an island. Once you go beyond these scientific names, we start getting into the cultivar name. And if you've never heard the phrase cultivar, it just means cultivated variety. Now we're getting into those things that humans have created. And here we have Camellia japonica comminato. Now you'll notice that Camellia japonica are in italics because they are Latin, but comminato is not, and it's in parentheses. That's important. Latin names are always in italics, but cultivar names are never in italics. And cultivar names can be in any language except Latin. They can be German, they can be Japanese, they can be English, they can be French, but they can't be Latin. These are names given to these plants by people who selected that plant for a particular character or suite of characteristics. In this case, this was a camellia that was selected for its beautiful flower, and it was given the Japanese name Kominato. Now, this is similar, Camellia Cornish Snow, but you'll notice it seems to be missing a word. Our binomial has disappeared. Camellia is still there, but where's the second word? Well, when a Latin name doesn't have that second part, that usually means that we don't really know what the parentage of this species is, or that the parentage is so complicated that we can't put it down in words. So Camellia Cornish Snow is probably the result of thousands of years of breeding where somebody took a Camellia japonica and crossed it with a Camellia sasanqua and got a product. They then took that and crossed it back with another japonica. They then took that and crossed it with its parent. They then crossed that again with another japonica. They then crossed the result from that with a sasanqua, and so on and so forth. And so in plant groups that have had a lot of breeding efforts, things like roses and clematis and iris and daylilies, you'll often find that that second word is missing. Here it's just Camellia Cornish Snow. Its ancestry is just too complex to write down right here. But Cornish Snow, of course, is the cultivar name. You'll see it's in English because cultivar names are never in Latin, and it's in regular non-italic font with those same parentheses. Still with me? So next we go on to trade names, and this is a relatively recent development in plant taxonomy, and really it's because money became involved. Here's a good example, Camellia japonica classique Kerguelen. What's going on there? So this camellia was bred and it was originally given the name Kerguelen. You'll see the word letters PBR after that. That means plant breeders' rights. This was a camellia that was developed by a nurseryman, and they are asserting that they are the only ones who have the right to propagate this plant. It's kind of like a trademark. It means that they are the only nursery that can propagate it. They have the full right to it. And if you have a plant like this in your garden that has plant breeders' rights, then technically you should not be propagating that plant, except for perhaps for your own use. Now, Kerguelen is not a particularly pretty name. When breeders are breeding things like camellias, they don't just do one at a time. They do them in their thousands. They will take across one camellia with another, gather the seed, which may be hundreds. They'll sow all of those seeds, and then they will grow on all of those seedlings. They'll look at all of them. And the reality is probably none of them will be selected as being good enough. But because they're doing it on such a large scale, they need to give names to all of these plants, and they don't really spend a lot of time making those names good. They just need, because they have to do so many of them. And it's not uncommon for the cultivar name to be a series of code numbers. But when they choose the plant that eventually becomes a sale plant, then they need to give it a name that is good, a name that will help to sell it. And so what they then do is they give it its trade name. And in this case, the trade name is Classique. I guess they figured Classique would be a better selling name for this plant. Now, a few things to notice about Classique. There are no parentheses. Trade names don't have parentheses. Also, trade names should be written in a different font to the regular word. The true cultivar name for this camellia is Kerguelen, because that was the name it was originally given. The trade name is purely to go on the label for the nursery that is selling the plant. Whew, it's getting complicated. So from trade names, we go on to hybrids. And hybrids are crosses between species. This is a hybrid camellia here. This is Camellia cross Williamsii Anticipation. So the end bit, Anticipation, that's its cultivar name. Like all cultivar names, it's in parentheses, and it has it's not in italics. In this case, it's in English. But what's going on in the middle of this Latin name here? Camellia cross Williamsii. That cross, which is not an X, it's not the letter X, it's actually a multiplication sign. What that's telling you is this is the product of crossing one species of camellia with another. And in this case, Williamsii camellias were created by crossing Camellia japonica with Camellia sasanqua. So if you ever see the name Camellia cross Williamsii, you know that it's this one particular hybrid. And from that hybrid, we've selected multiple different cultivars. So the position of that X is that multiplication sign is important. It's right in the middle there. And you'll notice it's not in italics. That's because it's not part of this Latin name. It's a multiplication sign. It tells you that there is a hybrid here. But sometimes it's not just species that hybridize. Sometimes it's genera that hybridize. Look at this one here and look at the position of the multiplication sign. It's right up at the beginning. What that's telling me is that two different genera were crossed here. And in this case, the genera were called Shima and Franklinia. And the two of them were crossed with one another. And when you cross two genera, you stick their two names together. So the Shim from Shima and the Linia from Franklinia were merged together to create Shimlinia. And these, what we call intergeneric hybrids, are pretty rare, but there are some very well-known ones in horticulture. So for example, if you take ivy, hedera, and you cross it with castor oil plant, Fatsia, you get Fatshedra, very common in gardens. And the other one that's very important is Leylandii, the Leyland cypress. That's also been produced by crossing two different genera. So if you look at its name, it'll have that multiplication sign at the beginning. And here are two of the longest plant names I've ever had the pleasure of working on. These both plants occur at Heronswood, and both of them have names that are too long to fit on the labels that we use. The top one is an aster, Symphyotrichum ericoides var prostratus snowflurry. So the genus is Symphyotrichum. The species is ericoides. This is var prostratus, which means it's a prostrate form. It's one that grows across the ground. And the cultivar is called snowflurry because it has lots and lots of these lovely white flowers. Below it, we have a Mahonia, an Oregon grape. This is Mahonia oiwacensis. The genus is Mahonia. The species is oiwacensis. But this is subspecies Lamarifolia, var tenuifoliola. It's quite a mouthful. Thankfully, most Latin names aren't as long as this. These are very much the exceptions, and almost all of the Latin names you'll have to deal with in your garden are just two words, that original botanical binomial, the original Linnaean binomial, genus and species. Now, if you've learned anything about language, if you've learned Spanish or Portuguese or Italian or French, you'll know that gender is important in some languages. And Latin is the parent language of Spanish and Italian and Portuguese. And so there are elements of Latin in those languages, and one of those elements is gender. In Spanish, you have feminine and you have masculine. Well, in Latin, you have feminine, masculine, and neuter. These are kind of important because they can change some of the names. And I swear this is the last page of text you'll need to look at. But it's important to recognize that different plants are given a different gender. And the genus is treated as a noun, and the species name is treated as an adjective. So that it's an adjective that describes the noun. So for example, Betula papifera. Betula is the genus, it means birch. Papyrifera is the adjective that describes it. And papyrifera means paper producing. So it's the paper producing or paper bark birch. Now, adjectives have to change depending on the gender of the genus. You'll have been familiar with that if you've ever done any Spanish. You get hermosa and hermoso, bella and bella. So the ending of those adjectives changes depending on the gender. And Betula is a good example of a feminine genus. And a lot of the time, you'll find that feminine genera end in the letter A. Masculine names often end in the letters US. So a good example is Ceanothus. And neuter names often end in the letters UM. So Cercidophyllum, Allium, Delphinium. You'll notice the names that I've put onto each of these, and you'll see that I've got a list here. So I'm showing you what happens in certain different examples. So in general, the species name is an adjective and it has to match the gender of the genus. So Betula papyrifera, they both end in A. Ceanothus thyrsiphloris, they both end in us. And Cercidophyllum japonicum, they both end in And those words, Papyrifera, Thirstiflorus, and Japonicum, change depending on which genus you're looking at. So, but there are a few exceptions. Latin, like all languages, is full of exceptions. And on the second row down, you'll see a geographical name, Washingtonensis. If you ever see a name with ensis in it, it usually is geographical. But look how it changes. Betula Washingtonensis, Ceanothus Washingtonensis, Cicidophyllum washingtonensi. These names only change in the neuter. Names that end in ensis always end in ensis unless your genus is neuter. So Washingtonensis, Washingtonensis, Washingtonensi. So lastly, the ones you can see at the bottom, these are plants that are named after people. And there are two different ways in which you can name a plant after a person. So you'll see the first one. I've been very modest and named them after myself. Betula baytonii, Ceanothus baytonii, Circidophyllum baytonii. You see, they don't change. If you were to translate those into English, they would refer to Baytons. So Bayton's birch, Bayton's California lilac, Bayton's katsura. They would be effectively a possessive word, and they don't change, and it doesn't matter what the gender of the genus is. But look a little further down and you will see some that do change. So Baytoniana, Baytonianus, Baytonianum. In this case, the plant is still named after me, but they've used an adjective instead of a possessive. So Baytoniana effectively means the Baytonian birch, the Baytonian lilac, the Baytonian katsura. And because it's an adjective, it has to change with the genus. And so you can see end in A, end in US, ending in UM. Last but not least, double I endings like Baytonii reference a male person. So Betula Baytonii would be named after a man. Betula Baytoniae, IAE, is named after a woman. So if the person that you're honoring is female, then your name is IAE. And you can see it doesn't change from genus to genus. Baytonii, Baytoniae, Baytoniae. Hopefully you're still with me. One more little trick up my sleeve. Look at the name at the bottom. This is the name, the Latin name for the common domestic apple, Malus domestica. What's wrong with that name? Well, immediately it sounds wrong, and that's because the genus, Malus, ends in US, so it sounds like it's masculine. But the species name, domestica, ends in an A, so it sounds like it's feminine. What's going on here? Is it a masculine name or is it a feminine name? Well, this harkens back to ancient Rome, and in ancient Rome, plants that produced a crop were given a male name, but they were considered female. Bearing fruit was something that was done by female. And so though the genus appears male, it's treated as being female. And you'll find this in a lot of fruit trees: Malus, Pyrus, Prunus, Ficus, Quercus. They're all plants that produce a fruit, and they all have an ending that sounds male, but actually it's female. So for example, white oak, Quercus alba. You'd think it'd be Quercus albus, but it's not, because it's a fruit-bearing tree, and therefore it's Quercus alba. Right, let's go look at some pictures of some plants. So Latin names of plants really fall into three different categories. They can be descriptive, they can be commemorative, or they can be other. And here we have four examples. The top two, on the left, we have Trillium grandiflorum. That is a descriptive name. Trillium because the parts are in threes, grandiflorum meaning large flower. Then we have a commemorative name, Jamesia, named after a botanist called James. And then we have other, and others are varied. Saruma, for example, is an anagram, and Camassia is a native name that's been transferred into Latin. So we're going to go through descriptive, commemorative, and other names, and I hope you'll see a lot of plants that you're familiar with. So let's start with descriptive, and one of the most common forms is color. Digitalis purpurea, purple. Acer rubrum, red, rubrum. Morus alba, alba is white. Veratrum viridi, viridi or viridis means green. And xanthorrhiza, xantho is the Greek for yellow. So xanthorrhiza means yellow root. Color is used all throughout plant Latin names because it's a nice, easy one, and it describes something about the plant. Shape too is important. We have Magnolia stellata, stellata meaning star-shaped, the shape of the flower. Balsamariza sagittata. Well, sagittata means arrow-shaped. If you are a follower of star signs and you are a Sagittarius, that's the archer. So anything that has sagittata in is arrowhead-shaped. Campanula. Campanula means bell-shaped. So if you see campan in any Latin name, it will refer to a bell, as in the bell flower. Darmera peltata. Well, peltate is an interesting word that means it's kind of like umbrella-shaped. It's the shape of a leaf when the stalk comes from the middle of the leaf. And it's pretty rare in plants, but a really common example is nasturtium. If you grow nasturtiums in your yard, you'll know that the leaf, the stalk comes right out of the middle. That is called being peltate. Gladiolus. That's a fun one. It comes from the same origin as the word gladiator. It means sword. Gladius is a sword. Gladiolus means little sword. And they get the name little sword because their leaves are the shape of a sword. Descriptions can refer to texture. Monarda punctata. Punctata is a great one because it actually sounds, it's onomatopoeic, it sounds like what it is. Punctata means spotted. Salix lanata. Lanata means woolly. And if you look at the plant, you can see it's covered in fuzz. Cereus, a common name in cacti, it means waxy. And in fact, this type of cactus is often referred to as a torch cactus. It's all covered in flammable wax. Spinosus, lots of people will be familiar with spinosus. It means spiny. And then we have the palm, Trachycarpus. I was telling you earlier about remembering prefixes and suffixes. Well, trachy is one you'll see all the time. Trachy is a prefix and it means rough. And carpus, you'll see that all the time too. That's a suffix and that means fruit. So Trachycarpus is a palm with rough fruits. And look out for both trachy and carpus in lots of different plant names. The plant's habit can be referred to in Latin names. Fuchsia arborescens, meaning tree-like. Most fuchsias are shrubs, but this one can grow into a tree. Indigofera pendula, pendulous. This is a plant that has flowers that hang downwards. Phlomis fruticosa. Fruticosa is one that confuses people. They hear it and they hear the word fruit. It has nothing to do with fruit. It actually comes from the Latin word frutex, which means shrub. Now, most species of Phlomis are herbaceous perennials, but this one is a shrub. So Phlomis fruticosa, the shrubby Phlomis. Prunus prostrata. Prostrata means lying across the ground, prostrate. And dendromecon. Now, again, that's another good one where you have a prefix and a suffix. Dendro means tree. Any plant that has dendro in it somewhere will be tree-like. And mecon means poppy. You'll see the word mecon in lots of poppy names, for example, Mechanopsis. Descriptive names can refer to things that aren't on the plant itself. For example, they can refer to habitats. And I think these are particularly useful because they're a way of telling you what kind of conditions the plant will need. So Caltha palustris. Palustris or palustri means marshy. This is a plant that's going to need to keep its feet wet. The opposite of that, we have Oreoxys alpina. Alpina means alpine, from high in the mountains. And another one you'll see that's similar is Montana. Montana means from the mountains, whereas alpina means from the alpine zone, which is high up in the mountains. We have Geum-Rivali. Things with Rivali come from river valleys. So again, another one that probably will like it damp. Acer campestri. Well, campestri means of the field. It's where we get the word camping, because obviously you camp in a field. This is a species that tends to grow in open areas. And lastly, Arenaria. That comes from arenarius, which means from sandy environments. Arenarias tend to grow on sand. Geographical origins are also a common descriptor in plants. Xanthodeschia ethiopica. Now, you might think it comes from Ethiopia, at least the modern country of Ethiopia. It does not. Long ago, before people had a really good idea of geography, people in ancient Rome I think it's ancient Greece actually, would refer to all of Africa as being Ethiopicus or Ethiopia. So actually, this plant comes from South Africa. It comes from the way at the other end of the continent. But when it was first described in Europe, they had a pretty vague idea about where places were in Africa. And so it got the name Ethiopica. Sanguinaria canadensis. And I did say earlier that any ending of ensis is geographical. Canadensis does, of course, mean of Canada. But be wary that plants with the name canadensis may not just occur exclusively in Canada. This is bloodroot, which occurs all along the east coast of Canada and the United States. And historically, the word Canada was applied in different ways to what it is applied today. Plants with the name canadensis invariably come from eastern parts of Canada, as opposed to the whole country of Canada, because the west part of Canada wasn't called Canada historically. Verbena bonariensis, a very common garden plant, and bonariensis refers to Buenos Aires. It tells you that this plant comes from Argentina. Silene gallica. Gallica refers to France, from the old name for France, which was Gaul. Often Latin names refer to the old name for a country. In fact, it'll often be the name that was used for that country by the Romans. And of course, the Romans referred to France as Gaul. So Silene gallica is of France. And lastly, Cathea. If you've ever flown by the airline Cathay Pacific, you'll know that those flights go into Hong Kong. Cathay is an old European term for the Orient, but more specifically for China. Geographical names can be useful, and they can sometimes be downright confusing. Seasons. All of the seasons are represented in our plant Latin names. We have Colchicum autumnale, the autumn crocus. Leucojum aestivum. Aestivum means summer. This is the summer snowflake. Equisetum hyamale. Hyamale or hyamalis means winter. And Ficaria verna. Verna means spring, vernal. What about Primula veris? Well, Primula is an interesting one. Primula comes from the word primus, which means first, like Amazon Prime or Prime Minister. It gets that name because it's one of the first plants to flower in spring. And in fact, the word primrose comes from prima rosa, which comes from primus again. It means first flower. Fragrance is an often used descriptor of plants. Fetidum, Erodium fetidum, means something that smells bad. Whereas Prosthetia fragrans means something that smells good. Fragrans is like fragrant. Another word used for a pleasant fragrance is odora, so Daphne odora. Now you'd think odora really just means odorous, means that it has a scent. It doesn't, but in general, if the plant has the name odora, it will be pleasant smelling. Another one being Resida odorata, also sweet pea, Lathyrus odoratus. All of those have a pleasant scent. And then the last one, slightly naughty, Caprosma. Any plant name that has osma or osmi in just refers to fragrance. So osmanthus, for example, which means fragrant flower. Caprosma has this prefix copro in it. And you may have heard copro from the word coprolite, which is a fossilized dinosaur poo. Caprosma means smells like poo. And to be honest, it seems a little cruel of a name. I don't know where it comes from either, given that most of the Caprosmas I've grown in my yard have smelled perfectly fine. But at some point, somebody must have smelt one of these plants and thought they didn't smell particularly good. Finally, uses. Plants often have their Latin name as a result of their use. Top left, we have Avena sativa, that is oats. And you'll see the word sativa a lot. It means that it's a plant that is cultivated. So if you see sativa or sativum or sativus, it means the plant is cultivated. This is cultivated oats. Calendula officinalis. Officinalis is an interesting one. It comes from the word officina. And officina was a room in a monastery that was where the monks did their work. It was the working room. And often it was the room where they would manage and prepare their herbs. They would hang them to dry, they would preserve them. That was the officina. And because it was the officina, plants that they had in that room were often referred to as officinalis. They were plants of the officina. So you'll see the word officinalis in lots of herb names. So Salvia officinalis is sage. And in fact, of course, officina is where we get the word office for a place of work. Vitis vinifera, grapevine. This is a good suffix to learn, ifera. If anything has ifera on it, then it produces something. Vinifera means wine producing. The coconut, Cocos nucifera, nut producing. So see an ifera, you know it produces something. Vera, aloe vera. Vera means true. It's where we get the word veracity. And aloe vera gets the name because it's the true aloe. It's the true medicinal aloe. There are lots of other aloes, but aloe vera is the true one. And you'll see that a lot in, again, useful plants. So pistachio is Pistachia vera. Cinnamon is Cinnamomum verum. That's the true useful plant. And then we have Pinguicula vulgaris. Vulgaris, like vulgar, means common. And in human society, vulgar tends to mean is an unpleasant word, but in plants, vulgar just means that it's a plant that's common and widespread. And indeed, this is a species that occurs all across the Northern Hemisphere. So commemorative names, we have a few different ones of those. We have plants named after collectors and explorers. So Clarkia and named after Clark, and Erythranthe lewisii, named after Lewis. And there are lots of plants named after both of those men. Douglasia nivalis, after David Douglas, the plant explorer. Kerria japonica, another Scottish plantsman whose name was Kerr. And Kalmia latiflora, Kalmia from Kalm, who was a Swedish botanist and a friend of Linnaeus. Scientists have plenty of names after them too. Selmisia hookeri. Hookeri references either William Hooker or Joseph Hooker, father and son. William was the founder of the herbarium at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and Joseph, his son, also was director of the Kew Herbarium and a great friend of Darwin. Darwin is also here in the next plant, Berberis darwinii. Fremontodendron, that references a American explorer and soldier, John Fremont, who was also at one point the governor of the Arizona Territory. Mathiasella is a fun one because it references a woman, and you'll find that plant names that are most often named after men, although more and more women are being honored as such. And Mathiasella references Mildred Mathias, who was a Californian plant collector and who died relatively recently. Torreya is after John Torrey, a very well-known American botanist, and you'll see the name Torrey in many different plant names across North America. Politicians and royalty, of course, also gets in on the act. Here we have Victoria, named after Queen Victoria, and next to it we have Saxe-Gotha, which is named after her husband. Her husband was Prince Albert of Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha. That's where he gets that name. Below we have Franklinia, named after Benjamin Franklin. We have Clintonia, which was named not after the current generation of Clintons, but by a former governor of New York State, whose name was Clinton. And of course, Washingtonia, named after George Washington. Plant names from mythology are very common. That's because early botanists and taxonomists love to invoke the heroes of the past. On the bottom row, for example, you can see Asclepias, which is named after the Greek god of hygiene. Heracleum, named after Hercules or Heracles of Roman myth. And Nymphea, the water lily, named after a water nymph. On the upper row, you can see some slightly more recent vintages. So we have the orchid Dracula, which comes from South America. And believe it or not, the Begonia Darth Vaderiana, quite well named because of its very dark foliage, and a relatively recently described species. Local languages can sometimes appear in Latin and are being used a lot more frequently in modern times to name plants as we become more aware of the sensitivities about using local words. Here we have two that are from Japan. So we have Karengashoma and Okuba. Those are both the Japanese names. And in fact, Karengashoma comes from three words: ki meaning yellow, renge meaning lotus blossom, and shoma meaning hat. So it's the yellow lotus blossom hat. Catalpa is a Native American phrase. It's a word that comes from one of the Algonquian languages. Camassia Quamash, both of those words come from the same native word camas, effectively, for this bulbous plant. And then Luma apiculata is a Chilean myrtle, and Luma is the native name from the indigenous community in Chile. Now, I said there were a few others. These are some of the weird ones. These two I particularly like because they are both anagrams. So Saruma is an anagram of Asarum, and Asarum are wild ginger, and indeed Saruma and Asarum are members of the same family. Telema, which is one of our native plants, the fringewort, it is an anagram of Mytella. And both Telema and Mytella are also in the same family. And these names often come about as a result of taxonomists really running out of imagination as to what to call a plant. So I have finally reached my end. It was a lot to bombard you with in a short period of time, and I'd be happy to stay and answer some questions. So if Cynthia is around, then I would be happy to answer.
I didn't leave yet. Thank you. What a fascinating trip through everything. It felt like everything. I'm sorry we didn't get time. I was hoping to hear a little bit about your garden. Perhaps once we've answered questions, you can
Absolutely. I'm happy to hang around.
us.
It's
Yep.
it's a little bit of an assault on the senses teaching Botanical Latin in an hour.
It is. It is. I'm just going to start with a question from Jude. And Jude asked, why the masculine, feminine, and neuter?
So those are just features of those particular languages. So as Latin evolved, that was how it was structured. And there are no real arbiters who decide what is masculine, what is feminine, what is neuter, and they don't always necessarily follow stereotypes of what male or what female or what are neuter. You find the same in Spanish. Different objects, all the different nouns have a gender assigned to them, and those don't necessarily match a particular feature, but it is important in those languages that are based on Latin that they have that structure. So it's really just a foible of the Latin language itself that we're kind of stuck with.
Okay. I did have a question about a particular plant that might be carried at Heronswood. Perhaps you could give us an email where that person could ask directly.
I'll stick my email address into the chat, and
that would be perfect. And then where is the official list or database located? Is it worldwide and kept in a specific country?
Now, it would be great to think that there was an official list, but there isn't. That's because, of course, scientists can disagree with one another, and nobody really arbitrates who is right, because right is a movable feast. What happens is somebody will name a plant, and if nobody comes and changes it, then that stays the official name. If somebody comes along and changes it, then that whatever they change it to becomes the new name, but then somebody can come along later and change it back or change it to something else completely. So it is a bit of a movable feast, which is difficult for gardeners. But one of the best places I find is a website that I think they're going to pop up for you, which is called Plants of the World Online. It's created by the Royal Botanic Gardens queue. It's fully searchable. You type in your Latin name, and as you're typing, it'll keep up with you, so it helps you with the spelling of the name, and it'll tell you if that is a name that is currently recognized, and it'll also give you the full geography of where that plant comes from, which is super crucial, because if you're trying to grow it, you need to know what conditions it lives in, and knowing where it's from will really help with that. But it is a tricky thing that there is no final arbiter or final list. Names can always change, but what taxonomists will tell you is that ultimately their goal is to change as little as possible. They only change things when they have to.
And there's been a lot of that lately, for sure.
That's why the tomatoes are in my talk.
Yes. Are there any plants utilizing indigenous names in their nomenclature? And I think you mentioned at least one during the talks.
Absolutely. So traditionally, that didn't happen very often. It's happening a lot more, and you find it a lot more in certain places. So, for example, in New Zealand, they very frequently utilize Maori names in the Latin names. So, for example, there's a plant called Phyllocladus toa, and toa is the Maori name. Sometimes it can be a bit more difficult. Here in the United States, plants can be very widespread across a big chunk of the country, and there can be multiple native names for that same plant across that wide range. And so sometimes it can be difficult to know which native name to use. So think of something like Douglas fir that's all across the West Coast. It probably covers the territory of 10, 20, 30 different indigenous peoples who will all have their own name for it. And so sometimes they don't use indigenous names because they don't know which name to choose. But more often in more recent publications, people are opting to go with the name that the local people use for that plant. That's a more recent development, but it's still an area of big discussion in plant taxonomy. And also some people are talking about whether we should go and change all Latin names to the local names. And some people arguing that that's the fair thing to do, others arguing that it would cause so much change that it would be hugely confusing to everybody. And I suspect that argument will go round and round and round the houses for the next 30, 40 years.
So no big change immediately.
I hope not.
So is there some kind of taxonomical organization that approves new names? Not really, it sounds like.
Kind of. So if you publish a new name, providing you follow the rules that are set out about how to publish it, then you can publish it. You can publish it whatever you want. Where there are conflicts, maybe somebody publishes a name that it looks very like another name that already exists. They have a thing called the International Botanical Congress, which is a meeting of botanists that happens every 10 years. And at each of these congresses, they have this opportunity where the botanists can get together and discuss names that have caused some kind of problem or contention or whatever, and have a ruling on them. So there is organization there, and there is a way of moderating this. But on the whole, it's allowed to be free, and it's allowed for scientists to just continue to work and to do their thing. And the Congress only gets involved in very specific instances where there's real debate or confusion caused by a name, or strong offense as well.
Great. And what do you consider is the most up-to-date source for current name and correct spelling?
So again, the Plants of the World Online for the Latin part of the name. Now,
Okay.
what that doesn't cover is cultivars, because cultivars are essentially a human thing. They're a thing for gardeners. Plants of the World Online is very much looking at wild plants. If you're looking for cultivar names and looking for them correctly, then a really good place is the Royal Horticultural Society's Plant Finder, which is available for free on their website. You can search for cultivar names there and get correct spellings or check that you've got the right one. It is based in England, and so it focuses on plants that are in England. And most of the plants we have here are in England too, but sometimes you'll find the plant's not there because it's only here in the US. But so far, it's really the only standardized way of looking at cultivar names. But the database of the Missouri Botanical Garden is not bad either. It's available online, and it will often have cultivar names in it too.
Okay. Several people saying how much they appreciated the presentation.
Thank you very much.
And then a slide showed a name with cross Williamsy. Where did the name Williamsy come from? It wasn't one of the two species crossed.
So when you cross two species, you don't have to take either part of their name to make that new cross. The name Williams comes from the Williamsii cross first appeared at a garden in Cornwall in the southwest of England, and the owners of that garden were called Williams. So that's why Williams was chosen as the name for that particular cross. And generally, the second name in a interspecific hybrid, a hybrid between two species from the same genus, like a species of Camellia and another species of Camellia, the second name can be whatever the author chooses it to be, rather than with a genus where you're combining the two names together into one word. That only happens when you're crossing different genera.
And somebody said, what brought you to Washington? Maybe that would be a great segue into just giving us a little update on your garden.
Well, alas, the evils of Amazon. My husband used to work for Amazon in England, and he was promoted and asked to move to head office. It was a bit of a wrench. I mean, I love living in the Pacific Northwest, but I just started, what was half a year into my job as the gardening editor of Gardeners World magazine. I was in a pretty good position and wasn't really looking to move, but it was a good opportunity for him, and it was a great chance for me to learn about a new place and discover new plants. Unfortunately, back in those days, that was what, 2012. If you moved to the US as a married couple where you were both the same gender, Only the person who was moving for their job was able to have a job. So when I moved to the US with my husband, I wasn't allowed to work. I couldn't be independent of him by US law. And so I had a lot of time on my hands, and I started volunteering at the Washington Park Arboretum and other places, and gradually got to know people in the Seattle area horticultural community. And one of those people in the end was Dan Hinckley. He asked me to come and speak at a conference that he was running. And after a while, I ended up at Heronswood. And for those who aren't familiar with Heronswood, we're a 15-acre botanical garden on the Kitsap Peninsula, which is on the west side of Puget Sound. We're owned and operated by the Port Gamble Sklallam tribe, and we're the only tribally owned botanical garden in the country. If you're an American Horticulture Society member, you'll have seen in their recent magazine, there's a big article about Heronswood, so that's a good place to find out more. But we specialize in the plant collections that Dan made over 30 years collecting in the wild. We have all sorts of different things, but lots of hydrangeas, lots of lilies, lots of mahonias. And we're open throughout the year for people to come and visit and enjoy our really amazing plant collections.
Wonderful, and so quick. You've clearly polished that, and really appreciate all the information. Hold on, I see a number of things here. Just a number of thank you for teaching, fascinating. Never been, but hope to in the next year up to Heronswood. And as Shuju says, we will send a link to the recording in the next couple days. And
she also asked me if I had any publications to recommend, and obviously I've got to plump my own book.
Of course, please do.
I did a book that was published just as COVID was coming on. It's called The Gardeners Botanical, and it's basically just an encyclopedia of botanical plant names. So if you're just new to learning plant names, it's a good place to start. It includes the names of many of our garden plants. So if you want to know what they mean, their meanings are there. But it also features a lot of the stories about why the plant got its name. Or what those plant names mean, and focuses on particularly important plants. So if you need a good doorstop, I highly recommend it.
And we've got a link to the book for sale at our local Powell's.
Excellent.
Although I'm sure it's available at the one that your spouse works at.
Doesn't work there anymore, so you can say about it what you wish.
No, I said what I had to say.
I love a trip to Powell's.
Yes, we're very fortunate to have it locally, and we really appreciate your time for our organization. And well, here's someone who says that they've been to Heronswood and actually applied to work there a few years ago. Gorgeous garden.
Well, we're very grateful that they came to visit, and we hope we'll see them again in the future.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Ross. And just one last reminder, we do have another webinar next week where we're focusing on lead in urban gardens. And we will be back again the second Tuesday of February as well. Lots to learn in January and February to get ourselves ready for the spring planting season.
Happy gardening, everybody.
Thank you.